LegaliseFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty, and war. LegaliseFreedom.com.
Hello, Jay. Welcome once again to LegaliseFreedom.com. Back with us today, part 2 of 2, I believe, on talking about your book, Esoteric Hollywood, and a lot of other related things.
Thanks, Greg. I had a good time talking to you last week, and hopefully we can up the ante and get even crazier.
Oh, well, I think that should be a shoe-in, that should be. Okay, last thing I mentioned last time was Michael Crichton. That just came up randomly in the conversation. Some people may not know, but he's the mind behind the ideas in some of the biggest movies, actually, in history. The first one, I think, of his that was made into a movie was actually the Andromeda Strain. Definitely, I think, a really smart film. Not an easy thing to watch at all for many people because it's about the process of science. You know, doing science. So although it's a thriller, it's not exactly fast-paced, shall we say. Sphere is another one of his. Westworld, of course, which we talked about somewhat last week. Jurassic Park might be his biggest success. And another favourite one of mine, The 13th Warrior, is his story. Although John McTiernan, the Die Hard guy, he directed that. But as I understand it, the version that got released in the cinema was kind of butchered. So I don't know if you've ever, read anything about Michael Crichton. I know he's done an autobiography, but I mentioned him in the context of being a very switched on guy, an insider. The reason he sprung to mind, I think, is because we talked last time about hidden agendas and secret messages and subtexts in movies and actually just overt propaganda in movies. And you mentioned then how some good messages can come through films, particularly people who know what they're doing, directors and producers and writers, and even actors sometimes who are switched on can inject these things into movies. And for me, I think some of his stuff works on two levels. I think there could be a lot of stuff in there perhaps directors have got in that's sending messages to us. But particularly if you read his autobiography, this is a guy that was really clued up about how the world works. And I didn't even realize the guy's dead. That shows you the last.
Well, he died. Yeah, he was very healthy, and he died relatively. Yeah, I mean, he's not young, but he died younger than I think people expected him to pass away. He died in, I guess, 2008. And yeah, I did. I have read up on his life and his biography because, like you said, I mean, he's been pretty influential in the land of movies. And then I remember watching Andromeda Strain, and I think there's even a few movies that he actually directed. So he didn't just write, but he also directed at times. There's that weird one with Tom Selleck too, that it's not that great of a movie, but it's funny because it has Gene Simmons as the bad guy, the one from the 80s with the little robot spider drones. I mean, it has some interesting predictive programming elements, is what I'm trying to say. Like, it's a future sort of dystopia where everything's run by AI. And Runaway, that's it. Did you ever see Runaway?
Yeah, I did, but I don't remember much about it. I just remember thinking that Gene Simmons couldn't really act.
It's a bad movie. It's almost B movie, but it is one of those ones that he directed, and it's his story. But yeah, what's interesting is that he did seem to know a lot about the interplay between the tech realm and humanity in that predictive programming sense. And so you get all the stuff with, biotech and genetic engineering and all that with Jurassic Park and Andromeda Strain. And then you've got, there was another one I think he did that was wild, that came out right before he died, called Prey. Are you familiar with that one, where they do all this testing on the monkeys?
Yeah, that might be the last one that came out before his death.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. 2002 was Prey. So, yeah, I think that, again, I can't prove, or I don't have any evidence for it, like a assassination plot, but you never know. I mean, this is, sometimes we wonder, did people go too far? But all of these films absolutely have some degree, some level for the most part of kind of predictive programming or maybe even esoteric elements.
Yeah, with conspiracies about, in this case, with people being bumped off, and we're not saying, by the way, this happened to him, we don't know, but it's become so rubbished in recent times. There's been so many glaring examples where people are saying, conspiracy theory, that this didn't actually happen, stuff that demonstrably happened in the world. People say, oh, it was a psyop, it didn't really happen. So even though people are lapping up conspiracy theories like never before, it's also got to the point now where when something is actually provable as a result of a conspiracy, people will still deny it. One of the responses to part one, the show we did last week, was for someone. I mentioned The French Connection is one of my favorite films, and somebody came back and said there's chemtrails in The French Connection.
I saw that.
Yeah, and I was like, really? I'm not saying there isn't, but I didn't notice. So, and then they went on basically to say there's chemtrails in virtually every movie. What function would that perform? Guess so. Yeah. If we look up at the sky and we see crisscrossing contrails or chemtrails, whatever they happen to be, that we will think, oh, that's normal, or that's okay. So, do you know what I mean? So I don't know if you come across this when you're writing about movies, and if you touch upon perhaps nefarious underhand dealings being spoken about, or that people are there's a certain cadre of people who are instantly dismissive of it,
Do you mean in terms of people being knocked off, like star killers, star whackers, that kind of stuff? Or what do you mean?
Well, I just mean that people responding to some of your writing, if you get into some of those areas, that they respond with like, no, you're nuts, man, without even looking into it themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. I mean, every day. Because I try to put up some kind of content almost on a daily basis, if not every day, then every other day. So yeah, I get a lot of, not a lot, but it was a lot. I got a lot more back when, maybe when I was starting to do this kind of stuff 6-7 years ago. I would get a lot more hate mail and a lot more friction and opposition from readers. But now it's, I guess a lot of those people just kind of faded away. And also a lot more people have, I guess, become clued into stuff because there have been so many big scale stories that kind of back up the conspiracy theory, things like WikiLeaks and Vault 7 and all that. And I'm not trying to debate the veracity of who all is behind WikiLeaks or Snowden or any of that. I don't have any problem doubting those things in terms of who or what they might serve in a big picture. But regardless, the content of what we were told by these characters like Snowden or in the recent WikiLeaks, that's all true. Right. And the Podesta emails and all this kind of stuff. If you look into those things, it really just goes to back up everything that we in the conspiracy world have talked about for so long in so many areas, especially the tech surveillance area. That the recent Vault 7 stuff really confirms all of that. And that's precisely what you had in so many of these movies, especially the sci-fi movies that we're talking, 10, 20, 30 years ago. They were telling us about the phase of the age of transition that we would enter into, where everything would be dominated by some kind of centralized AI grid. And, you mentioned Logan's Run. That's what we see in Logan's Run. It's what we see in Zardoz. We have this giant supercomputer that's supposed to kind of be the brains of the city, or this giant macrocosm, giant man, Adam Kadmon city or something like this, that's run by some big supercomputer. And you had all these sci-fi shows and books and novels, that were telling us this decades and decades ago. As to how much that was implanted by the Pentagon, it's always difficult to say. But I think as we were talking about last time with like Heinlein, there's definitely in many of these cases a direct connect between in the U.S., for example, the deep state, the military-industrial complex, and a lot of these characters. Now, that's not to say that all these characters liked it or thought that the deep state was good. I mean, I don't get the impression from Philip K. Dick that he liked all the dystopian stuff that he wrote about. But as I understand from people who have researched him and written books on his life, he was, in the circles of Silicon Valley people. So he was being told back in the 60s and 70s what the Pentagon was going to do in building that region up. And by the way, I don't usually make a big distinction between the public idea of government and the Pentagon and the military industrial complex and this so-called private sphere of competitive free market businesses like Google and Facebook and In-Q-Tel and all that. I don't really think there's that big of a distinction because, as we know, the revolving door phenomenon, a lot of the people who go from Google go to government and then go to government to Google, right? I mean, these things are kind of interchangeable revolving doors. And so I see this whole skeletal structure maybe behind what's out there in Silicon Valley. And I was actually there about 6 months ago and got to see all these tech. I didn't tour the tech companies. I'm just saying I was kind of touring California, the state, because I hadn't been out there in a long time. But you see this, it's just, there's just like this giant grid and you wonder like what's underground here, right? And then you start to realize that, like you mentioned, Dave McGowan's book, and my dad was in the military. He was stationed in San Diego back in the 80s. And there's all these giant bases in San Diego. Some of them are actually like secret. There's islands with secret military naval bases. And then you start to realize this whole state is a giant military industrial complex state. So it's not accidental that the Silicon Valley, that's the heart of the whole tech transhumanist type grid, is out in, California, up near Palo Alto and all that. So I don't think that that's accidental. I think that the whole state of California, is this kind of test bed for where they take things. At least in the U.S., it's kind of a 20-year ahead of time type thing where what you see happening in California eventually filters out to the rest of the country, maybe New York as well. Kind of the two edges of the United States then kind of just spew, they vomit their poison inwards towards the middle of the country. But all that to say that, we mentioned Michael Crichton and we mentioned predictive programming and all the haters. There's not as many of those haters anymore. They're dwindling away because so much of this stuff is just so in your face. It's like, how do you, people can do it. People are very skilled at cognitive dissonance and convincing themselves to believe bullshit. But after a while, it's like, you really can't deny the fact that every single day there's some giant news story that comes out, even in the mainstream media, which is controlled, that tells you that we're being put into this giant AI grid that's coming.
I worked with David Icke for a year, not often directly one-on-one with him, but mostly with his son. We made a music show together. But I got to talk to him many times, just one-on-one in private sort of thing. And so I got to find out, basically, the guy isn't crazy, okay? Let's just say that up front. You don't have to buy into everything he's saying. But the reason I mention this is because he still does his gargantuan presentations, which he does usually at Wembley Arena in London, and thousands of people turn up for those. But to be honest with you, I looked at the last one he did, and it was not just because I'm familiar with it, but it was almost passé. Mainstream TV here in the UK actually made a documentary a few years ago called David Icke, Was He Right? And it addressed all of the stuff that he's been talking about for years that is palpably happening. It is there, right in front of us, and still you talk about cognitive dissonance. There's still people who will, I'm just using David Icke as an example because he's so well known, certainly this side of the pond, but because he says it, he can say, the sky is blue, or at least the sky appears to be blue, and people say, no, because David Icke said it. So it can depend on who's saying what, if you see what I mean, right. In what form the information is presented, what channels it comes to us through. And I think a lot of people have a tendency to dismiss, or had certainly anyway, to dismiss fiction. It's a work of fiction, so it doesn't matter if there's facts in it. It's a work of fiction, ergo it's false.
Well, this is the old thing with British intelligence that you would see where you go back to, around the turn of the century. And because I think a lot of the writers couldn't put like William Somerset Maugham or Joseph Conrad or any of these, Conrad, I don't think he was intelligence, but any of these other characters, even Orwell, who, had periods where they worked with intelligence agencies, they would figure out a lot of this stuff. They'd learn a lot of this stuff, put the pieces together, be told stuff, overhear stuff, whatever. But they couldn't talk about it because of various legalities and official secrets acts and all this kind of stuff. So, the classic way to get around that is to write it into fiction. So I tend to think that predictive programming really just sort of arises out of the the whole idea of spy fiction. I mean, certainly you could probably go back further in fictional accounts. And I mean, if you wanted to, you could probably go all the way back to like the Bhagavad Gita or these kinds of Mahabharata, these different ancient Hindu texts that even talk about, you know, like advanced technology and gods flying around and zapping each other with lasers and shit. But so I guess in a way, you know, the ancient myths and the ideas of crossbreeding and basically what's done in, you know, biotech and GMO engineering and all that kind of stuff. You could argue, I guess, that that's all based in the principles of ancient mythology. But if we set that aside, more modern examples, you know, you've got Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, that you have these alchemical notions there. You've got the myths of the golem. I've argued for a while that you could kind of see those as predictive programming, I guess, in a way. But moving up into the 20th century with the rise of the novel, so to speak, and the detective novel, you know, with Conan Doyle and things like that, you have this burgeoning of spy fiction. And this is something that I've covered quite a bit, which in my research, I think was really kind of fostered by the establishment. And there's actually academic sources to back that up, that the system even wanted there to be a lot of this idea of spy fiction, because it would kind of eventually over time make the notion of surveillance and giant government bureaucracies of spies everywhere and these networks of informants and all that, so which has been going on forever. I realize that I'm not naive, but I'm saying that the popular culture tradition of spy fiction is, I think, directly connected to panopticism, right, which is the older Jeremy Bentham philosophy of total surveillance. This kind of coalesces with the spy fiction that you get from a lot of these writers, and it conditions the public over time to think, oh, actually, all of these violations of, you know, my privacy or whatever, it's all actually kind of sexy and cool because, you know, you've got all these dashing characters trotting the globe and, you know, banging all these hot babes and getting all the info and saving Western civilization, or all this the nonsense around it. And it builds up a whole culture to where, you know, we've got to have these CCTV cameras on every corner, everywhere, because of all the terrorists, because of all the threats, all the dangers. And this is what all the spy fiction does, is just prop all that crap up, right? I mean, and that's the real indoctrination, not the, as I've said so many times, not so much the news. I mean, the news matters. It is an angle of psyops. It's very important. But way more people are going to go see James Bond. Way more people are going to watch Jason Bourne than are going to watch, you know, boring Alan Partridge news presenter, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I remember saying, I did an interview with a guy, New York journalist, Harvey Maloch, I think is how he pronounces his name, but he wrote a book called Against Security, arguing that a lot of what he called security theater is there just so, in a situation where nothing can be done, just to be people to be seen to be doing something, if you see what I mean. And I said, if you had told me in the 1980s that we would be going through the BS that we go through in order to get onto a plane these days, I would have said, no, people are not, that's not going to fly. I would have said, people are not going to be taking off their belts and their shoes. You know, they'll just won't do it. They'll just think, look, man, are we being sent into Belsen here or something? You know, do you want our gold teeth as well? You know, it's just, that's not going to happen. And it has. And as much as I try to be in a zen place when I'm going through an airport, I see a lot of people getting very agitated, being treated like cattle. And actually, it was in New York, funny enough. Flew into New Jersey, into JFK. I think that's the one that's in New Jersey. On the way back out again, it was a very unpleasant experience, I will add. On the way out again, I remember just for some reason I was drawn to this woman, and all she was doing was stood in a queue, a very long snaking queue, waiting to go through security. And I just noticed her, and she had been crying, and she was almost in tears again, and she just looked broken. And I thought, wow, you could stick her in Schindler's List as, you know, one of the death camp inmates, and it'd be like, just right there, that's what she was behaving like. And I thought, she's just broken, and that's for all the people who are getting indignant about the humiliation of the security, there's 10 people who are just totally submissive to it.
Yeah, and I think that was the whole big role of fiction over many decades, was to put people into that frame of mind, because, you know, we know that the mind stores these ideas over time and it places them in the subconscious, even if they're not the stories that we watch. I'm saying all these movies, and they kind of get thrown down the pit of our subconscious, and they just kind of mill about down there, and we don't even recognize it. But over time, we've watched so many of these films and read so many of these stories, which, again, they may be enlightening. I'm not saying you can't enjoy lit. I do. But at the same time, they kind of, I think, condition us. You know, I guess that's cliche, but it reminds me of, there's a book that kind of influenced my book, by a guy named Frederick Hitz, and I think he's like a CIA professor or something like that. He had some role along those lines, but he wrote a book called The Great Game, The Myths and Reality of Espionage, and the whole thing is just about spy fiction and the history of spy fiction. And he talks about these different characters, like I said, William Somerset Maugham he was like the first one to write about giant spy bureaucracies rising out of the wartime. So if you listen to my Tragedy and Hope talks that I did, you'll know that I tend to support Quigley's analysis that World War I and World War II were basically engineered by the bankers. And one of the things that the bankers preferred was to have giant spy bureaucracies. And Maugham writes about this in Ashendon, his novel, and then you go to Graham Greene, and Graham Greene talks about the exact same stuff. He talks about how he liked the idea of the American CIA, but that they weren't tough enough on terror and all this nonsense. So, I mean, these once you understand, by the way, that these spy people, spy agencies, espionage, all this stuff, that it's not really any different than the techniques that local police do in entrapment situations. It kind of loses its luster and the sexiness of it, because you realize, oh, this is actually just, you know, entrapping shitty people by other shitty people who've probably been entrapped by the government. You see what I'm saying? All the sexiness of it kind of loses its luster when you realize that, you know, it's not George Clooney seducing Mila Jovovich. It's like, you know, some whore somewhere being rounded up by some big old fat cop. You know what I mean?
I don't know if I mentioned it last time, but when I was at university many years ago, I met a young guy who can only have been a couple of years older than me at the time, so he's probably about 25 or something, and he worked at GCHQ, which is the big spook central here in England. And
like NSA over there, right?
Yeah, that type of thing. And obviously the surveillance technology was much more limited back then. But the reason I mention it is because he said it was actually really boring. He was looking to get out of it, but it was quite a well-paid job. And he said they're paying us well, partly to buy our complicity, to buy our silence, because we have to sign the Official Secrets Act and all of that. But he said it's not very exciting work, and he honestly thought it was going to be a bit more dramatic. He said, no, I didn't necessarily think it was going to be James Bond, but, you know, I thought it would be a bit more action than this. And this is one of the things that I think the Bourne films actually had quite a profound effect, directly or indirectly, on the Bond films that came after. You look at something like Casino Royale, the James Bond film, quite a different Bond there. It's the toughest Bond that we've seen. And the reason I mentioned Bourne in this context is because a lot of what you see the spooks doing in that is just the lower level ones. They're just sat at computer screens in rows. They might as well be at a call center somewhere, you know? And it actually looks like really dull work.
That's the funny part that Le Carré puts in his novels, is that it's not sexy. It's actually pretty boring. And he's just this guy who's, you know, worried about his wife cheating on him.
Yeah. In fact,
you know what I mean? That's more realistic, obviously. But the reason I was saying all that is just that it kind of promotes this idea of voyeurism in the pop culture. And I think that this is something that's a persistent theme in Hitchcock, is his obsession with voyeurism, and he happens to make all these spy espionage-based story films, you know, tons of them. And it really just kind of propagates the idea of the fetish of voyeurism for the general public. And then you've got Facebook, and what all the housewives do but sit around on Facebook all day at home and try to, like, basically spy on the other housewives and, you know, other dudes and all this kind of stuff. And guys are like creeping girls on their Facebook profile. So this is all like, the spy culture, I believe, is intentionally released into the public in all of these things like Twitter, Facebook. These were all created by the spy agent. The internet was created by, wartime military intelligence, communications, right? Cryptography and all this kind of stuff is what birthed the internet through the Pentagon and so forth, and Stanford Institute and DARPA and all that. And so here you have this giant spy agency device, or technology, this medium that's then released to the public. Well, I think it would be really naive to think that our deep state overlords released the internet to the public because they care about everybody and they want everybody to have easy access to information and to purchase their dishwares through Amazon, right? I don't think they care about that. What I do think they care about, as we've said, in the long term, is building this giant AI grid that we see in Zardoz or Logan's Run.
Yeah, you get the idea just talking about who'd actually be doing this rather boring work that isn't James Bond at all. If you picture the fat loser sitting up at 4:00 in the morning, hunched over his computer with his bucket of fried chicken and his bucket of cola, that's probably the ideal recruit really for doing surveillance, because they're actually going to get quite turned on by the whole idea. In the same way that, now I'm not trying to make a direct link here, please, but in the same way that it's proven that, pedophiles put themselves in work positions, if they can, sometimes, where they'll be around children. It's no great surprise. Before I forget, if people want to see, you mentioned John le Carré there, if people want to see what might actually be more day-to-day type work for an espionage worker, if we call them that way, if they look at the films, anything with Michael Caine playing Harry Palmer, and he's kind of like the antithesis of James Bond in some ways. You just watch any of the films. There's one film in particular, I can't remember which one it is, but it's.
I like $1 Billion Brain a lot. Yeah, those are great. They're great. They're kind of funny because they're anti-Bond. Yeah,
there's one of the films where it shows him his morning routine, him getting up in the morning and making coffee, and I can't remember what he has for breakfast. It might be an omelette or something, and then he goes off and goes to work. And he arrives at the office building and it's like, oh wow, man, this is terrible. And then he goes and sits down at his desk with one of his co-workers, and it emphasizes, the kind of general dullness of it all. And in contrast to Bond, we should probably talk about Bond because you've got a section where you analyze a couple of the Bond films in your book. You may have done analyses of other ones, but a couple actually show up in the book. And you look at it, for example, people thinking that Bond is kind of like the guy that they want to be, or, that's the ultimate alpha male. But Bond's a psychopath. He's actually very unlikable. And I would not want to go drinking with Bond. If I did, I'd just be picking his brains about some of the supervillains and what they were really like. So, type of thing. But, so yeah, Bond as a character, a nasty piece of work.
Yeah, it's really the films that turn him into something different. There's a lot of literary debate and discussion over what Ian Fleming was ultimately trying to convey with the book character. And as I'm sure you and probably many of the audience know, these novels started out just kind of as pulp fiction. They weren't really taken seriously in any kind of academic sense or literary sense, but for whatever reason, that eventually changed through the famous essay that Umberto Eco wrote about the narrative structure in Ian Fleming's Bond stories. And this, I'm not exactly sure why, but this, for some reason, gave Fleming's writings academic prowess, right? So they kind of took on a new role of the appreciation of pulp fiction, which again had been derided as something kind of base and vulgar prior to that. But over time, I guess probably consonant with the rise of science fiction, if you go back to Fantastic Stories magazine or all these older sci-fi things, it was considered very puerile, very adolescent, goofy, silly stuff that over time, it's kind of like comic books, they kind of rise to this new level of prominence that, in our day, I don't, if you were to tell people 50 years ago that you had Superman and Batman as these goofy TV shows, but I don't think anybody could have imagined that you have these giant that all of Hollywood would be propelled by Marvel stories. You know what I mean? Like, that's all there is in Hollywood is these giant $1 billion Marvel Avengers, Captain America blockbusters. That's like the totality now of what propels Hollywood. But I think that people would have found that very strange. And I think in the same way, the revolutions that you have in literature, where you have the rise of these formerly vulgar disciplines like science fiction and the sexy spy novel, you know, the 10-cent dime store novel, rising to prominence, you know. And I guess we could debate whether that's engineering or not. Could be. I wouldn't be surprised. I think that Umberto Eco certainly had a lot of questionable connections, and he was, I would argue nowadays, I used to be a pretty big fan of his, but I kind of see him now as kind of an agent of the deep state and the conspiracy, if not perhaps an illuminist. I think you could probably make that argument based on what all he puts in his novels and his level of prominence. But he certainly was a key player in making Bond an international hit in terms of the novels. And then you get the rise of the movies with, you know, these and if I remember from the Lycett biography of Fleming, it's Aristotle Onassis is who wants to put up the money for the first Bond film. And he was friends with Fleming, and for whatever reason this didn't go through, but I've always found that fascinating that the original, I think he wanted to make Dr. No first, and he told Fleming, I'll pay for it. So here you have this international villain character who kind of matches up at times to Blofeld or Emilio Largo, you know, in the Bond stories. But well,
you talk about Willard White, don't you? The character in Diamonds Are Forever, and he's based on a real world character. And it was interesting that film, Howard Hughes, that's right. And that film was probably ahead of its time. But it was interesting because obviously Fleming didn't write all the Bond stories because, right, you know, I think they just wanted to make more films than there were novels. But, and indeed, not all the novels. For example, if you look at Thunderball, the movie and how that overlaps with Thunderball, the book is not really the same thing at all. But in later Bond movies, they were starting to, even with Pierce Brosnan as Bond, they were trying to move a little bit into the so-called real world, you know, so there was no more hollowed out volcanoes. But they had that one with Jonathan Pryce playing the media, a newspaper magnate.
Yes,
which was, I remember. That was quite an interesting wrinkle. Now that, obviously Bourne kind of still blew all that stuff away in terms of like bringing it into the real world. But even in the whole basis of Bourne is still kind of like, some people look at it and go, yeah, that stuff, you know, how he's basically a programmed undercover agent. He doesn't even know who he is or what he is. And he's double crossed. And, you know, still I find people saying, yeah, that's not really how the world works. But actually, if you allow that it is partly how it works, it explains a lot of things that we actually see. You know, things make a lot more sense.
You're absolutely right. So this idea of the super soldier, which is kind of made fun of, I mentioned Marvel a minute ago, that is actually what the Marvel stories are based on. Like with the X-Men, these are people who, now granted, I understand in the storyline of X-Men, it's these people are mutants who have evolved and all this kind of stuff. But set that aside for a minute and think about X-Men First Class, which is the big movie that was trying to tell the backstory, you know, with Jennifer Lawrence and Michael Fassbender. Well, in that, they all work for the CIA. The CIA takes in all these gifted super soldier types, right? Who are going to work for the good of humanity on all this nonsense. When we look at the Avengers, we see that same tendency. And what was the character of Captain America? He's literally a super soldier. That's his whole backstory, is that during World War II, he's recruited as this little noodle-armed nothing thin dude, and they pump him up into this jacked, you know, guy who can run 100 miles an hour and, you know, throw trains and shit. So you've got all this fictionalized notion of the super soldier, which is a lot of that's baloney, but there's an element of truth in that, because when you understand that there are these notions of, in the background, mad scientists, MK Ultra guys. And if you remember in the Captain America plotline, which I do have analyses of the Captain America and Avenger films at Jay's Analysis, you'll remember that it's the military, the Pentagon, Deep State, who are doing this. And the Winter Soldier, the bad guy, his former friend, if I recall, it's like the Soviets that start with, mind experiments on him. And then in the sequel, it becomes he gets reprogrammed by whoever the bad guys are. I can't keep up with all the bad guys, and I'm not a big comic book fan, but he basically gets taken over by the bad guys, and these people are super soldiers, right? So now, how could any of that be real? All right, now if you go to which I cite several times in my book, John Marx's old book from the late 70s on MK Ultra, which is in a way watered down and somewhat censored, but it's still pretty phenomenal what you can gather from that book that he wrote. I can't believe he wrote this in the 70s. And he describes in the last chapter is so important in that book, the connection between MK Ultra and biotech and electronic warfare. So all of the implants and the Jose Delgado and Ewan Cameron, and I believe it was Delgado is the one who was and Jolyon West, these guys are they're giving acid to elephants at the zoo. Jolyon West did this, just madmen. Delgado is putting the electrodes in the brain of the bull. So you've got Jolyon West giving LSD to elephants. Maybe that's where the trip scene in Dumbo where he's tripping out is maybe Jolyon West gave Dumbo his LSD. The point of all that was just to say that you've got this clear connection that John Marx makes in his book that I talk about some in my book, where the MK Ultra program morphs into DARPA and the implanting of electrodes. Now, what is all that? That's transhumanism. That's the modification, the biometrics, all of that. The soldiers taking on these new roles of kind of like cyborg type characters. And at that point, I know this sounds ridiculous, but you can even go to like these dumbass Jean-Claude Van Damme movies, right? Like Universal Soldier or Dolph Lundgren or Time Cop, where they're literally super soldiers. You know what I mean? So you've got all of this stuff in these fiction stories that, again, even something as ridiculous as Kurt Russell in that Super Soldier movie, I forget the name of it.
It's just called Soldier.
Soldier, yeah, that's a total bomb. But even in these goofy, dumb ones, these B movies, you've got this kernel of truth that, yes, all of that MK Ultra stuff morphed into biowarfare at Fort Detrick. It was called MK Search, and it morphed into DARPA and transhumanist super soldiers, quite literally.
Getting back into David Icke territory, you talking about MK Ultra reminds me of another big connection here, which is how much the occult tends to overlap here, and also, you get that coming into the movies, into Hollywood, which is what we're talking about. And I'm sure I watched a TV interview many years ago with a guy called Michael Aquino, I think he pronounced it, and I think he led a break-off organization to rival the Church of Satan, which was Anton LaVey's thing. So I think it was Michael Aquino. I'm sure I read his name in connection with MK Ultra, and you initially you go, hey, what? But it makes complete sense. And I know we talked about Eyes Wide Shut last time, or at least we mentioned it, and in the context of all of this. And that's basically, you address this occult thing, don't you, in your book as well, no doubt in many of your other written pieces.
I do, because in the case of Aquino, he has a book on black magic, and he argues that people who do psyops and people who do black magic are kind of in the same boat, because really what they're wanting to do is alter the perception of the target enemy or audience or whatever, right? So if you're David Blaine or David Copperfield, you're up there on the stage and you want to convey a ruse, right? You want to distract the people from what's really going on, and you want to get them to believe something that's they know isn't true, but everybody going into these theater, we kind of suspend our disbelief, which is the same principle behind movies. You sit in the theater and you suspend your cognitive rational faculties to imbibe the arts. And so Aquino argues that this is really the same thing that a kind of a psyops dude, in the military is doing. And that's precisely what he did, was a, high level army psyops guy. But what, I think often gets forgotten in relationship to all of the fantastical tales and I'm not saying they're true or false, and I'm not like a big historian of Michael Aquino. I've just looked at the one book that he wrote and his, essay, his psyops essay, which nobody ever seems to remember. I think the psyops essay is the most important thing, because here you have this high level guy who's into black magic in the military, and he writes this essay from Psy War to Mind War, or from Mind War to Psy War. I forget the exact title, but what's most relevant in that essay that he wrote with other military dudes is the last section and the last few footnotes, where he talks about, you mentioned earlier, atmospheric engineering, chemtrails. He talks about that in that famous essay. He talks about electronic and MK Ultra type technology to be used in EMF type warfare, is what he talks about in that famous essay. So again, now we're back to MK Ultra. So if you want to make a direct connection, well, there's this actual paper that makes the direct connection to EMF warfare, which, by the way, that's directly connected to, implantable chips and microbe, what do you call them? The electrodes in the brain, right? The stuff that Jose Delgado was doing. This is referenced, by Aquino in his document. So I think that's the element that's forgotten when people will talk about the Temple of Set or whatever. If we're discussing psychological warfare and the reality, the thin line of reality between movies and military tactics and whatnot, I think you have to read that essay that he wrote.
Talking about Bond films again, one of your essays in the book is Moonraker and the Breakaway Civilization, you've called it. That was the Bond movie that came out in 1979. Roger Moore was playing Bond at that point, and it's a pretty weak installment in the series, I have to say. But it reminded me that whether it is going off planets, or whether we're talking about Bond villains now, or whether it's the release of some kind of virus, whether it's mind control, as we've been talking about, whether it's stealing nuclear weapons to blackmail people, whether it's genetic engineering and modification. One of the themes coming out from these sort of this shady organization of Spectre and the various villains is the idea that just is the breakaway civilization. It's the idea that the cattle, the masses, are to be done away with, or if dumbed down effectively. That there is an elite here and there is an agenda. And you saw that idea comes out again and again and again. You saw that, Elysium, that movie from recent years, which I haven't actually seen. And people say it's not very good, but very powerfully suggesting this. And as you say, this stuff becomes more and more plausible as time goes on. And there's very little updates between some of the core ideas and something like, Moonraker, or even some of the deep state stuff in Diamonds Are Forever. It's kind of just like, as you say, it was predicting this, kind of right. Now it's here, but you still have this resistance to it, kind of like, well, yeah, I mean, Elysium's just, it's just a movie or whatever. It wouldn't really. So I do wonder sometimes how does cognitive dissonance, how much that breaks down, because you talked earlier about people waking up to a lot of these things, but then you still see various agendas moving forward, particularly the transhumanist one.
I think that, this is what I've been pondering that very question a lot recently in relationship to Trump. Now, I don't really care to debate Trump or anything like that at this point, but you would have, for example, during last year and during the campaign, Trump saying all kinds of wild conspiracy things. Like, he would talk about vaccines, he would talk about all this kind of stuff, and you're like, how is he tweeting this stuff and saying this stuff openly? It's pretty crazy. And then, this week things are looking pretty bad, at least from the American perspective, because Trump seems to be supporting this idea of, Assad's got to go now, and this whole neocon line that he campaigned against. Not that it's surprising that a politician would go against what they campaigned on. I mean, that's kind of like, unless you're a total Stockholm syndrome glutton for punishment. I mean, this is what every politician in all of history has done, right? They go against their campaign promises. So not necessarily surprising, but rather I would say unfortunate, because I think many of us who were cautiously optimistic were just simply hoping for a change in foreign policy in particular, because that was so central to the globalists, right, is this idea of the destabilization campaigns and regime changes that the CIA has been doing for the last 50 years in countless countries. We were hoping for, maybe a little bit of alteration in that program at least, but it's not looking good on that front. So the point being, well, so how does that relate to people waking up? Well, what I think happens is that I think the system establishment doesn't really care about people in the short time frame, so to speak, waking up to something, right? Because what's going to happen is, even if they wake up to, say, the false paradigm of right and left, they're eventually, I think, going to be corralled back into just some other thing that doesn't matter, right? So maybe you wake up to the false left-right paradigm, and then I'm just using this as an example. I'm not trying to argue with you or anybody who has this view, just as an example. So let's say you wake up to that, and then maybe you get involved in libertarianism, right, which is very popular in the U.S. And so you're in the libertarian movement, and then, you're doing your activism, and you're arguing for von Mises and all this kind of crap. And then eventually what happens is you realize that this doesn't do anything, and the whole history of libertarianism was created by the CIA. It's run by guys from the CIA. David Rockefeller loves libertarianism. He wrote a whole master's thesis, if I recall, on von Hayek. So this is all controlled too. It's not a solution. There may be aspects of libertarianism which are correct in terms of critiquing Marxism or the bad economic theories of, hardcore socialism or something. But that doesn't mean that the solution is going to be banker plan beta. And that's what libertarianism and the gold standard and all that was. You read Quigley, he's got 2 chapters on that where he says, yes, this was the bankers back in the 1700s promoted libertarianism, and Adam Smith and David Ricardo and all this kind of stuff to destroy the existing political structures in Europe. So what I'm getting at is that you can't step back a couple centuries to some system, which is most often the presupposition of maybe the Ron Paul supporter in America or something like this. And I know all this because I saw it directly. In my 20s, I was a big Ron Paul fan. Yeah, let's stop the wars and all this kind of stuff. Which I'm still anti-war, but I'm just saying the system also has these kind of corrals that are already set up for you to be kind of shifted into if you wake up to the left-right paradigm. And I think that what's amazing is that even in Brave New World, Huxley has that there. He has that levels of propaganda for the various strata, even in the totally socialistic world government. And what's amazing is that I think a lot of people have missed this in the novel. They understand that, it's a technocracy. It's all about clones and everybody who's the lower mass slug omega class. They don't have genders, and they're just kind of these drones and all this stuff. But what's interesting is that even the alphas in Huxley's system, they believe a bunch of stupid bullshit because they've been programmed to it, right? And it's only at the sort of the last, the climax of the novel when John the Savage and his buddies, they kind of solve the whole thing, and they figure out, the whole thing's a scam. The whole thing is a lie, right? Even the alphas believe a bunch of bullshit. And by the alphas that we could, maybe your Harvard grads and the people that, go into, Harvard law, and they set up their law practice, and they're, some big Democrat or GOP law firm or something like this. The professional class, right? What we might call, quote, the alphas. Maybe they're making $1-2 million a year. They all believe in the system. They're still convinced of the bullshit, right? I mean, you go read people who write for the CFR, which I do this actually quite frequently. I'll go read foreign policy articles. I'll read CFR articles, and you see that this is supposed to be the cream of the crop, the smartest people. They actually believe a lot of the bullshit. They believe the war on terror, right, is real.
Yeah.
Now, I think at the higher levels, you get to the Kissingers and the Brzezinskis, I think these people realize that this is a lot of bullshit, and that, this is largely foisted by conology, and as you said earlier, like terror theater and all that kind of stuff. Because Brzezinski, and I think that I was just reading one of his key quotes yesterday. He said back in 1973, in Between Two Ages, he said the key to all of this is understanding that the long-term goal is technocracy. And it doesn't matter what happens within the short span, like within these theatrical elections of Trump and Clinton and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I'm not saying it totally doesn't matter, because you might get some shifts in policy. Maybe the TTP doesn't go through. Maybe Obamacare doesn't happen, this kind of stuff. But ultimately, that's not that big of a deal, I don't think, to the globalists, because they're looking at it in 50 and 100-year spans. And I mean, come on, is anybody really even going to be knowing about Obamacare in 50 years? Probably not, right? What are they going to be dealing with in 50 years? They're going to be dealing with what Brzezinski talked about, technocracy. That's what's going to be on the table. This meantime bullshit doesn't matter. And I guess that's just been hammered home to me recently. And I think that's the point that you're making there, is like, well, what does it mean for people who wake up and are still caught in another level of dialectics, right? And I mean, it's not just 2D chess. It's not just 3D chess. It can also be 4, 5, 6D chess.
Yeah, I'd love to have been a fly on the wall in the 48 hours or so after Trump won the election, because I genuinely believe that, and also Brexit, by the way, I see these events as very, very closely linked. Brexit being when the United Kingdom recently voted to depart the European Union. I believe these were genuinely asymmetrical events that went against what was intended to happen. And the reason I say I'd love to be a fly in the wall in the Trump camp is because at what point was he sat down and had a talk with? Has that happened yet? And I remember clearly Jesse Ventura, just linking us back to the movies, the guy.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, he became a state governor, and we know him from films like Predator, and he's the guy with the tash who, I'm a goddamn sexual tyrannosaurus, that guy. And
well, Greg, one of the things I learned when I became governor was that the CIA briefs you. They take you in a basement, sit you down with about 12 other people you had no idea. They're all CIA, and they say, Jesse, do you remember John F. Kennedy?
Brilliant. Well, this is exactly, people are wondering where that speech is coming from. He recalls when he was elected state governor, I can't remember which state now, but he was sat down by some guys, some suits, guys talking into their sleeves, showed up in a black car, and they sat him down and they, wanted to find out where he was coming from. They wanted to get to know him. And I think this may be what is happening with Trump now. They're kind of like, we think we know this guy, but we need to know what he's thinking, because this is a wild card. And you could argue that people who can't be brought under control, if not on side, they go the way of JFK.
I think that what they'll do is they'll look for any possible means to reel you in, and they can do that eventually. So even if they don't buy you, I think that there's a great talk that interview that somebody who did it. It was I think it was Tim Kelly interviewed the George Webb, I forget his name, but he's the guy who's made all these videos about the Clinton Foundation and the disappearance of this Eric Braverman character. And anyway, they did a really good interview where they discussed the methods of blackmail. So there's all these different tricks, and this goes back to kind of the tradecraft and the intelligence espionage type stuff that we talked about earlier. What the establishment just basically looks for any way that they can, get the dirt. Right. So if it's not pictures of you with whores or pictures of you with maybe underage kids or something like this, then they'll move on to something else like, wiretapping Trump Tower and seeing if they can get some dirt. I mean, this is the standard fare stuff that the establishment has done forever. Like, I mean, you even go back to like, if you watch Downton Abbey, I don't know. I mean, in the U.S., it was actually probably more popular in the U.S. than it was in the U.K. I don't know, but a lot of people in America watched Downton Abbey, and they were really into it. And I had a buddy who I thought it was like, this is some chick thing. I'm not watching this. Well, I had a friend who really smart English lit guy. He was like, oh, you need to watch this. And the only reason that I found that relevant, the reason I watched it was because one of the things you notice is that the prevalence of the gossip. So like the servants will learn all the deets, all the details on the nobility in the story. And if the nobility pisses one of the servants off, well, they'll just leak the gossip, right? And this can actually cause quite a bit of scandal. Now, why do I say that? Well, because that's kind of relevant to what we're talking about with what the way the establishment works. The establishment will try to find out any kind of dirt, whatever they can, blackmail you. If they can't blackmail you, they'll move to, wiretapping you, surveilling you, finding dirt that way, leaking stories to the press, and so forth and so on. And this is just how the whole giant parasitical, hideous system works, right? I mean, I know that's probably cliche. It sounds like, oh yeah, well, everybody knows this, but actually that is how it works. And that's what is coming out now. Again, WikiLeaks. This is what we're seeing with the wiretapping of Trump Tower and all this. All of this was literally what was going down, and it's exactly what Jesse Ventura was talking about. You're absolutely right. I can't believe. I'm glad you remembered that. I'd forgotten that story. But if you remember what he says in the full version of the story is that he says, I was actually taken to a meeting. Guys in suits showed up and they were like, hey, we want you to come have a little meeting, and, it'll be a fun little coffee gathering. And he says he went to like the basement of some building, and he said there was all these people from the community in there, like people that you would not expect, like housewives, and then maybe some local businesswoman and some guy at the Rotary Club or something like this, right? And there's 10 or 20 of them in there. And they sit down and he says, oh, well, we are all of the local Central Intelligence workers.
Yeah, that's
at least how Jesse tells the story. I have no idea, what's true or false in that, but I could certainly believe that.
Yeah, that's so reminiscent, isn't it? Of like, there's a bunch of movies that are like that. It's kind of almost like an invasion of the body snatchers type scenario. Do you remember the TV series?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And the kind of rule or They Live from John Carpenter. This idea that the people around you may not be all that they appear to be. They may be much more. They may be much less. But,
this is an old, go back to Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth was known for her vast spy network. She had spies everywhere. And you'll see this come up in movies and in fiction as well, where, even kids, are paid to spy. I mean, how many times, I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of one, but there's plenty of movies where, like even, like the little, sort of peasant brat kids that are running around the street are paid to be spies. And it's very easy to get those people, because they don't have any other means, to live. Like, I mean, they're destitute, right? So obviously they're going to spy.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of the things that they use to compromise people or bring them down, if necessary, involve sex, doesn't it? It just seems to be like it's kind of a primal urge, isn't it? A sort of a weakness that can be exploited as a weakness. But make no mistake about it. I mean, it's so easy to do. If they, quote unquote, had a problem with you or me, it would be so simple, particularly as we are people with limited power and limited influence. We don't necessarily have friends in high places. I don't know about you, but you know what I mean. It's all they would have to do is to produce a laptop computer from somewhere, put some child pornography on there, start to shout about it, and that's it. You're going away. No one will have anything to do with you again. Friends, family are going to disown you. You can be banged up for as long as they basically like, and your reputation is ruined. And hopefully, as far as the authorities are concerned, you would just do the decent thing and kill yourself. End of problem. Do you know what I mean? So it's super, super easy. To do.
There's a lot of different ways too, and that's the scary part. There's the Well, I think also with this fake news trend is another way that they're going after people who are, putting out alternative information. All they're going to do is basically just, put into the browsers things like, oh, this is a fake news website. You know what I mean? And then sort of ban it, shadow ban it, ghost banning. They've already been doing all this for a long time now. And, so, I mean, that's not the same thing as blackmail, obviously, but I think what they're going to start doing is that type of stuff for alternative information. They're even, making lists of blacklisted sites and stuff like that. So, this is the typical means and methods of the establishment. And again, it always goes back to that kind of entrapment type stuff. I remember reading it was a police officer wrote this, a book, I think it was some years ago, but, he basically wrote for people who were activists. This is back when I used to do more activism type stuff, but he'd written a book on activism and entrapment and all the means and methods of the police and what they're going to do to try to disrupt you and all this kind of stuff. And what was funny was that just how it's the exact same stuff that, you have with sex espionage and entrapment, all those kinds of tales that you get in spy stories, with sex workers and sex kittens and all this kind of stuff. It's all exactly the same stuff. Like it's the same thing is what, I know we said that earlier, but I was just thinking about how useful, if we remember the stories that have come out, like the Anna Chapman story, and I'm not sure I believe a whole lot of that. That's probably a lot of theatrical bullshit. But if you remember the Heidi Fleiss stuff, right, and this ties into Hollywood, I think that's how, like, you could see how to, if you're an intelligence agency, that a lot of the sex blackmail stuff, that you want to have connections to the madams is what I'm trying to say, to make it simple. Right. And I believe it came out that that's what was going on with some of the Savile UK type stuff, was that MI5 or somebody had a lot of these guest houses, quote unquote, tapped and all this kind of stuff. Hasn't this been coming out for a long time with the UK politicians? Yeah,
well, absolutely it has. Well, yeah, and I think a lot of the stuff like Bohemian Grove, for example, which some people still dispute, you can get people involved in ways like that. It's seen as, like, as you say, oh, come along to our little meeting sort of thing. It's a fraternal society, blah, blah, blah. And before very long, you can find yourself in a position there, well, I don't actually want to know anyone to know about this. Initially, perhaps because you think you've been given the keys to the executive washroom and you don't want to let anyone else share them. There's some advantage for you here.
Yeah.
And I remember, most of the men in my family, all now passed on, were Masons. And I remember my uncle talking about it, because he was the sort of person that would, brag. And I remember him talking about, meeting celebrities at these Masonic meetings, ones that you would travel to other countries for.
Oh, wow.
And it was, not sort of people you'd normally bump into. And I remember my grandfather, as someone I have immense admiration and respect for, and he wouldn't talk about the local Masonic lodge that he went to. And I didn't ask him about it very much, because I could tell I knew him well. So when it did come up, and I can't remember what form of words he used, but it was like, I'm not going to talk about that, just leave it. And so I did. And so I think that's definitely, there's another way of the people joining these organizations, and it's one thing leads to another. Reminds us of Eyes Wide Shut again, doesn't it? That you're in now. You're in now. There's no getting out.
Well, there's this great book, Builders of Empire, Freemasons and British Imperialism. It's more of an academic book, but the woman that wrote that was kind of her thesis, was just that this is basically an international surveillance secret network that is in the service of the British Empire. It may not have as important a role nowadays as it did. I'm not saying it's not important, but her book is written on the period of 1717 to 1927. So certainly Freemasonry had a much, I would argue, much more important role then, perhaps, than it does now. Because, I'm not saying that human to human intelligence doesn't matter. That was kind of one of the points of Skyfall, was that, we've still got to do the old school British intelligence spying. We can't just rely on the tech geeks. But, the last few Bilderberg meetings have been about the handing of the baton, from David Rockefeller and these characters over to the tech people. All right. And so you had all these tech people, Regina Dugan, I mentioned earlier. You've got people from DARPA who go to Google, and then they go to Bilderberg. And what's she doing there? Well, she's at Bilderberg saying, oh, it's going to be so great because now everything will be bodily modification, body mods, and implantable microchips. That's literally what she said at, I think it was 2 Bilderbergs ago. But anyway, the focus of the last 2 Bilderbergs was completely on technocracy, as far as we know, what's come out about those. And you've become more public now that they've been given attention. It's not really a secret confab like it used to be. It's a little more public now. But anyway, point of all that was just to say that, there is still the relevance of the human to human spying type stuff, but it does seem to be, even in that realm, transitioning over, again, just almost totally dominated by the tech stuff. And then, that's where we're going. Like, everything's going to the tech realm. Bertrand Russell talked about this a long time ago, and he said that, eventually you're not even going to have cash. You're going to just have the credits that the world government gives you. And if you don't spend your allotted credits that week, they go away. And this is, I think, what we're being set up with through a lot of the electronic currencies. I'm not saying that everybody into Bitcoin's bad. I'm not making judgments on you. I'm just saying that can also be a preparatory phase for, having a chip in your hand that you swipe, and this deducts your weekly credits, right? So that you can go get your vegan bar at your while you're living inside a giant Target. I'm not joking, by the way. They're actually making giant Target apartment complexes where you live.
Yeah. This is now getting into like Soylent Green territory, isn't it? You got this.
Yes.
You will eat this thick paste. Well, yeah, what is it though? It is green. Yeah, but and
Soylent Green is made from people.
Excellent. Your Charlton, where
Another Charlton. I was trying to do my Charlton again.
Where is he now? And also the idea of George Lucas, his THX 1138,
right.
That kind of a dystopian view of the future. But Bill Gates, for example, the Microsoft guy, who doesn't know him now. Now, I don't know much about his background, but I don't think he was ever groomed for insidership. I think he just started something and it snowballed. He was in the
No. I have to disagree with you there.
Okay, well, let me just say then, and you can fill us in on this, because I wouldn't, this is obviously something I don't know about. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, these types of people, the Facebook and Google people that you mentioned as well. If anyone thinks, no matter what their background, at some point, if they were outsiders, if anyone thinks that they weren't taken to one side along the lines that we mentioned with Jesse Ventura, I think it's very naive to imagine they're just allowed to do their own thing.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had some conversations about this on some other podcasts I've been on, and we were theorizing on this very point. And my view is that you can have people who are recruited into certain roles and groomed and prepped for them over time, and it doesn't really matter what class they come from ultimately. So it's not totally a class structure in the sense of the older British class structure or Hindu caste system or anything like that. Because, as some writers say, you've got bloods in the brains, right? So you do have like these older families that are what you might call maybe bloodline families or something like that, or old money, right? But you also have the more technocrat, scientific minded individuals of like a Brzezinski or Alvin Toffler or these kinds of characters. And so they would be like the brains, right? So you've got old money, Rothschilds, Bloods, and you've got the brains like the Kissingers and the Brzezinskis and the Tofflers and so forth and so on. And then because of everything kind of shifting into the tech dominance and the coming global AI grid, Internet of Things, these kinds of people are a lot more important than, some old family that has a bunch of money. Not saying that those old families don't matter. I'm just saying that, if you are building the AI grid, you're a lot more important than, some old bitchy, baroness in a castle or something.
Yeah,
like
and
this.
some of these so-called elites are actually pretty stupid. Not
Yeah.
talking about inbreeding now, but they're not the sharpest tools in the box. You've only got to look at the British royals. Some of the, not the ones who've married into the family, but some of the others. If we were in a level playing field, like we talked last time about, these survival shows, you're pitting one person against another, the royal prince is going down, let's put it like that.
Well, it was in the case of Gates, if I recall, his dad helped basically set up Planned Parenthood. Now, whatever your views of women's reproduction or whatever, the modus operandi behind Planned Parenthood is absolutely 100% about depopulation. So Gates's dad was, if I recall, some kind of high level, like he got some military type status. I don't think he was a general or anything like that, but I'm just going from memory here. But he was important in the deep state military apparatus, and then played some important role in Planned Parenthood and the rise and creation and expansion of Planned Parenthood. And so Bill Gates comes from this kind of military tech family that is obsessed with population control. So he was already groomed for that stuff. So I'm not sure I buy these stories. Like, if you remember, Social Network is a good example, that movie that came out. And the movie gives this presentation like, this is just nerds in their basement slapping away at keyboards and algorithms and, coming up with who's got the coolest idea and this kind of stuff. And could you sell this in Silicon Valley? I mean, there might be an element of truth to that, but even Social Network gives you this little hint with the scene where he gets like this secret funding from these people. It's kind of brief. It's been some years since I watched that movie, but there's like a brief scene where, he meets with these kind of shady backdoor dark room people in suits, and they give him some of the front money. Now, in reality, that is In-Q-Tel, and In-Q-Tel was a CIA front company that helped start both Google and Facebook. So once again, we see the fingers of the deep state directly involved in the big tech stuff. So I would argue that, I'm not saying that Bill Gates is a CIA stooge. I think that somebody of that level is way above the CIA. I mean, the CIA people are, Bill Gates has a lot more power than Robert Bayer. Okay. That's what I'm trying to say. And so likewise, when you look at even some of these characters, and even some of the billionaires though, like an Elon Musk or Peter Thiel, if you look at some of the front companies of the CIA, like Palantir, this is a Peter Thiel company. So again, there's a neck and neck sort of, you talk about inbreeding, like the inbreeding between the CIA and these big tech companies is heavily inbred. It's very incestuous. So I'm speaking of just of the relationship. I'm not saying Bill Gates is inbred. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally. Well, in some ways, then, as drab a Bond villain as Bill Gates would make, in some ways you can see the equivalent. These kind of megalomaniacs, if not in terms of their personal ego, but certainly in terms of their reach, planetary reach and the power to affect everyone's lives. Certainly echoes some of the Bond villains. It's just, Bill Gates doesn't live in a hollowed out volcano, as far as I know.
I believe he actually, if I recall, he was famous for having this giant complex that was a smart house. If you're familiar with the ideas of a smart house, which is actually the model for what will be the smart city, which the smart cities are being introduced now. They're in the process of creating the giant AI grids that will, there are test cities that are like Singapore and Rio that are being converted literally into smart cities. So that means everything in this city, it's going to be so convenient that, anywhere you go in the city, the city will recognize you, and there'll be free internet, and you can, type into your iWatch, your latte order ahead of time. This is all nonsense, of course, because the whole thing is just a giant prison complex, right? So you're actually going to be living in a little coffin-sized thing above a Target, literally. And Watson is going to watch you from the center of the city. This is exactly what's in Zardoz and in Logan's Run.
Yeah, exactly. It very much so. And I would throw in THX 1138 again, because that's virtually the definition. I mean, that's even located underground. That's almost
right.
That's the very definition of a smart city. Okay, well, Jay, despite the promises that I made last time, we haven't actually got around to properly discussing Zardoz and Logan's Run and other related movies. We're actually going to turn this into a 3-part series, and we will definitely get to those movies next time. In fact, we'll start with those. Until then, tell people about your website, the book that we mentioned at the top of the show, and just anything else you want to put out there.
Sure, jaysanalysis.com. I think there's 1,100 posts there, so there's quite a bit of content over the last 6 or 7 years that you can dive into. A whole bunch of archives, 120 film reviews, 500 or 600 other articles that I've written on various topics: philosophy, literature, history, geopolitics, comparative religion, the esoteric. All of that is there, and even some goofy, humorous stuff. I just wrote a really, really preposterous joke analysis of La La Land, the big Oscar winner this year. And yet, even still, it doesn't matter how ridiculous I make these, some people will still think that they're serious. Most of them are, but I write these really dumb ones, people take them serious. But anyway, all kinds of stuff there at the site, and there's tabs. You can order the book inside the U.S. and outside the U.S. signed. I know it's a little bit pricier than Amazon, but that's why Amazon undercuts the authors and tries to sell a book for $10, and the author makes like 50 cents or $1. And then if you get it directly from me, it's a lot better for the author. So you can get a signed copy directly from me. And then I also do lectures and talks and analyses of, big global stories or geopolitics or history or philosophy, Aristotle, Plato. I do talks on all these topics, esoteric stuff, and you can find all that at jaysanalysis.com.
Cool. Okay, well, until next time, and part 3, third and final part. Thanks a lot, Jay, for joining us again on LegaliseFreedom.com.
Thank you, Greg.
Diamonds are forever. Hold one up and then caress it. Touch it, stroke it, and undress it. I can see every part, nothing hides.